Welcome to our session. It's going to be on digital assets in the law. My name is Josh White. I'm an assistant professor of finance at Vanderbilt University, and I want to thank Fahad for inviting me to moderate this session. We've got two fantastic speakers in the digital asset space. We have Hermine Wong, who is currently a lecturer at the University of California, Berkeley's Law School. And Hermine's son, Lincoln, is joining us today on the call and is really excited to be here. John Reed Stark runs John Reed Stark Consulting, and I'll give you a little bit more information on their background in a second. All three of us have worked at the SEC in different periods, some overlap, and so given the SEC's huge involvement in this space, I hope that this session is more like you're a fly on the wall at the SEC, and we're talking about current issues, and you've got two experts that are legally trained but are really good at unpacking things in layman's terms. So we won't probably talk as much about exogeneity as we will about arbitrary and capriciousness today, but it should be fun. So welcome. And so how this panel is going to run, we're going to talk for about 75 minutes. We've got four broad topics. We've sort of front loaded the more important ones, and I'm just going to let the conversation be more organic and maybe throw up some questions for John and Hermine and let them chime in. If you have a question, please throw it in the Q&A. And when it's the right time, I'll work it in. We're going to leave some time at the end of the talk so that if you have some particular questions or there's things that we didn't discuss that you might want them to speak about, we can go over those. So welcome. So let me introduce our panelists and give you just a little bit more on their background. So again, John Reed Stark, he's a senior lecturer at Duke University School of Law. He's the president of John Reed Stark Consulting. John's got a very long biography, and so I tried to get it down to something tangible. He leads efforts really in cybersecurity, data breaches, digital forensics, and digital assets. And so John is was the founder and chief of the SEC's Office of Internet Enforcement. And I'll let John maybe talk about some of that genesis as we go through. He also spent 6 years as a managing director at Strauss Friedberg, and was 4 years was the head of the firm's DC office, working on digital risk management and the technology-related law enforcement. So John's got lots of experience within the SEC and also with legal entities that interact. He's an author of the Cybersecurity Due Diligence Handbook. And he's a notable voice in media discussions of cybersecurity. In fact, I think John and I first met in a Twitter space. He often hosts those on Sundays. He's, as I mentioned, senior lecturer at Duke University Law School. He's also had taught for, I think, 14 years as an adjunct at Georgia. So, John, thanks for joining us.
Sure, absolutely. Great to be here. Great to see Hermine, and great to see you, my friend Josh. Love these academic exercises, especially with some SEC alumni. It's just an opportunity to really dig into an agency that most people just don't understand. And even though I worked there 20 years, there are some things you'll see I scratch my head all the time. So just so great to be with the two of you. Really was looking forward to this. I've been looking forward to this.
Thank you. No, thanks so much for joining us, and hopefully we'll open up the black box, but maybe not get to the debt box. We'll try to shed some light on the SEC. And so Hermine Wong is a lecturer, as I mentioned, at UC Berkeley School of Law. She also advises founders, VCs, boards, and emerging tech industries. She's really heavily involved in both blockchain and AI, and is located in the San Francisco area. Before establishing her own practice, she led the policy team at Coinbase. And Coinbase, as everyone knows, is the first publicly listed U.S. crypto exchange. She spent a decade in government. We overlapped at the SEC, where she was an attorney and counsel. She also worked for the Office of Information Regulatory Affairs, Office of Management and Budget, spent some time in the White House and the State Department, and the Pentagon. And so I think you hit every agency, Hermine, in DC. So definitely we have an expert on somebody that's briefed members in Congress and the White House, and can talk more, not just about law, but also unpack it, as she was involved heavily with economists at the SEC. She frequently appears in the Wall Street Journal, Reuters, Forbes, holds a JD from University of Michigan's law school. So she's still coming off of the high of that national championship. And she has an undergraduate degree from UC Berkeley. So she's back home now teaching. So welcome, Hermine.
Thanks so much. I just reiterate everything John said. I have been looking forward to this as well. It's fun to be in front of a new audience. And since you mentioned it, Josh, go blue. And yeah, thank you for having me.
I thought you might be still excited about that. So. All right. So we had a talk like this It was almost exactly a year ago, and had Scott Bogus from Coinbase and Zach Fallon, who had worked with me at the SEC, and some others. And it's interesting. I was looking at my notes from a year ago, and I wrote down, "Are cryptos security? Are they a security? What is an investment contract? What is a security?" And that's something we discussed last time. And so this audience has seen a lot of that talk, but it's still tangible. It's still something that is part of the enforcement cases that we'll talk about. So I think maybe what we could do is start off just talking about regulatory trends, some different things that are going on, especially at the SEC. And then maybe I think the audience is going to be really interested in the litigation cases, especially. There's a lot of them. But before we started, John was saying that he's read so many of these cases, and there's so many of them would be precedent setting in other spaces, and they're happening at warp speed. And so
Yeah.
I think we can talk some about those. And then we'll see how much time we have, some other topics. But John, just in a very brief sense, can you just describe the notion of crypto assets meeting that definition of a security? We've heard the Howey test, so maybe just sort of in a nutshell for non-legal trained people, what would that
Well,
be?
yeah, thanks, Josh, and thanks, Hermine. It's so great to see you. And for me, because I was chief of the Office of Internet Enforcement for 11 years, when the internet first came around, before that, I was special counsel for internet projects starting in 93. So essentially, it was the Wild West back then, where people were selling eel farms, ostrich farms, and every conceivable concoction when the internet first started. And it just hasn't stopped. There's just this constant desire to offer investment opportunities directly to people. And I get it, why not? Why not have investments offered directly to people? Why have all these intermediaries? Why not let people make their own choices? Caveat emptor, right, Josh? But that's not the framework of securities laws. So you go back to 1929, right? And there's this terrible crash. All these bad things happen to the economy, all this systemic problems, everything starts hitting everything else. So trying to avoid that, the Congress enacted the 33 Act, and they said, hey, you know what? If you're going to sell securities to anybody, you got to register those securities. So can't be like, selling baseball cards or, even it's going to have a very special set of responsibilities if you want to do that. That was the 33 Act, right? Then came the 34 Act, which said, hey, you know what? If you're transacting in these securities, like you're a broker or a clearing firm or an exchange or one of these entities acting as an intermediary, you're going to have to register with the SEC. And what does that mean? That means all kinds of scrutiny, inspections, examinations, audits, net capital requirements, licensure, all sorts of regulatory safeguards, to make sure, again, in this area of investing, that we don't have enough in 1929. Then comes the 40 Act, right? The 40 Act is, well, if you're an investment advisor or a mutual fund, or you're trying to get these investments together, or you're recommending those investments to people, then you have to register with the SEC and you have to be specially licensed. So you have this history since then. And so the first case that comes out of this is it was actually a case before Howey, but Howey becomes the biggest test of this big law, saying, okay, what's a security and what's not? And the point was with securities regulation, and people always say, well, it's regulation by enforcement. There's another word to use for regulation by enforcement. It's called enforcement. That's how it works. There's no law saying next door to, if I steal my neighbor's lawnmower, there's no law that says you can't steal lawnmowers. There's a law that says you can't steal. And then somebody interprets that to say it means lawnmowers too. So that's how the securities laws are. So they sort of said, okay, well, what's a security? And, again, there have been so many cases written about what's a security. So let me try to boil it down to something very simple. What they call the economic reality. If you're giving your money to somebody else and they're doing stuff with it and you're hoping to make some gains in that, then it's a security. It's the efforts of others. You can have, there is parts of the test, vertical commonality and horizontal commonality. So Howey, eel farms, ostrich farms, all these really bizarre investments have all been declared securities. My favorite are prime bank securities, which are these, they're bogus notes which purport to represent the secondary market for standby letters of credit, right? right? Huge mouthful. Sounds very sophisticated, sounds very interesting, all sorts of disintermediation in the aspects of these prime banknotes. But guess what? They were a complete fraud. There's nothing there. There's no there to prime banknotes. So the SEC started bringing these cases, and the defense counsel started saying, but these aren't securities. You just said they were completely fictional. And, you know, one of the circuit courts, I think it was the Fourth Circuit, looked at this and said, well, you know, even if they were what they purported to be, that would be a security, and that's enough. So the idea is that when the SEC, when Congress created the 33 Act about these offerings, they realized specifically that there were going to be iterations. So that's when the initial coin offerings came out. The defense counsel said, no, these aren't like normal investments. These are coins, they're tokens, they're based on the blockchain. Well, no, then we got a bunch of cases, Telegram and Kik, and a whole bunch of cases the SEC brought where courts said, yes, they are. Then after that came the simple agreements for future tokens, SAFTs, and another iteration of crypto assets. And the courts in, I think it was Telegram, said, nope, those are securities, also need to be registered. Then came, some of these celebrities that were touting the tokens. And there's an anti-touting statute that says you can't, but you can't, if you're getting paid to promote a security, you have to disclose the nature, source, and amount of that compensation. Well, Kim Kardashian, Steven Seagal, DJ Khaled, John McAfee, all these people were promoting these tokens that the SEC said were securities. And that statute, the 17B of the Securities Act, says specifically it's a strict liability statute. So even if your lawyer said it was okay for you to do this, you're still going to find to have violated Section 17B of the 33 Act. So they go from ICOs, they go to simple agreements for future tokens, to promoting these tokens. Then they have these staking programs, and those have been in several decisions, including one recently involving Genesis and Gemini. The staking programs where somehow you're buying a stake in some part of the blockchain or some token, whatever, but it's the efforts of others. And that needs to be registered under Howey. Then there were these crypto lending programs from Celsius and BlockFi. The defense counsel said, no, these are not securities. These are lending programs. Well, if you looked closely at them, they were still securities. So if you look back at generally, and again, I could lecture on this for 10 hours because there's so much case law on it. And there have been probably more than 200 SEC cases now where the law has gone the SEC, the decisions have gone the SEC's way, and very few that have gone the other way. In fact, I think they're completely distinguishable. But the most recent, there's a quote from Thurgood Marshall in a case called Reeves, R-E-V-E-S. And I'll read this quote, and then I'm interested in hearing Hermine and you talk about it. But here's a decision where they were talking about, again, whether something is or is not a security. Here's the quote. In defining the scope of the market that it had wished to regulate, Congress painted with a broad brush. It recognized the limitless scope of human ingenuity, especially in the creation of countless and variable schemes devised to use the money of others on the promise of profits. Congress, therefore, did not attempt precisely to cabin the scope of the Securities Act of 1933. Rather, it enacted a definition of security sufficiently broad to encompass virtually any instrument that might be sold as an investment. So that's like just sort of the bare bones of why the securities laws exist, of how they are applied so broadly, of why they're not prescriptive in terms of specific, but they're very general. So they were designed incredibly and ingeniously to capture this. Why? Because when it comes to investments, we want to protect people a little bit more. When it comes to systemic risk, we want to protect everyone in markets a little bit more. So we enacted this whole framework. And, crypto assets fit plainly and squarely in there. And that's been decided over and over and over again.
Awesome. Thank you, John. That was a fantastic description, and also taking us from the 30s and sort of saying, how does this apply to emerging technologies? I really enjoyed the quote. Hermine, I want to get your take either on that, and also, Coinbase has argued that if crypto is a security, in fact, we'll talk maybe a little bit later about the petition that they gave to the SEC for rulemaking. Then maybe other collectibles. I think, John, you mentioned,
Baseball cards.
baseball cards. I think Coinbase has referenced Beanie Babies. So what are the parallels and what are the differences here that you see in some crypto products versus others? Some definitely look like a traditional investment security. Others are unique. And this is where, to John's point, that limitless scope, does it apply and are there parallels? And if not, what's unique about that?
Yeah, so I'm so glad that John also starts out with 1929 and the 1930s, because that's where I start up the discussion with my own class in law school about crypto. And the reason I start off there is for the same reason. Like, why is the agency around? It's to protect really bad things that have happened both to our financial system and a lot of bad actors in the financial system. However, there is a distinction between the 33 and 34 Act that I think is really important to have, which is that with the 34 Act, we started baking in a lot of intermediaries. And if we think back about the 1929, 1933, 1934, one of the fundamental differences of that reality versus our reality now is the fact that we use technology in a fundamentally different way, right? Like, these things aren't happening over the course of days. Settlements aren't happening over the course of days. We aren't having people going around couriering, trades, and paper is like not the de facto MO of how we conduct our business. In fact, what we can do now, because of the internet and because of our technology, is that these things can happen at a scale and a transparency and an accuracy that was impossible to achieve before, like fundamentally impossible. And there's real reasons why we had to bake in a lot of these intermediaries, because we wanted to ensure both the transparency of what was going on and the accuracy of what was happening. And now, if we are totally technology agnostic, I think that everyone can agree that in the matter of, like, if people are fat thumbing things, even if it's not intentional, fat thumbing some figures can have really drastic problems. You write a trade order incorrectly, you hear something on the phone incorrectly about what your client wants. There are all sorts of, safeguards to protect that in a human-based world, but in a technology-based world, we don't need those same safeguards. So then what happens is that by continuing to rely on those safeguards to apply to a technology that makes it irrelevant, is that you increase a lot of the cost, you increase the time, and that all ends up being paid by someone. And that someone, let me promise you, is not the business. That someone is going to be the end consumer. Or the end investor and the SEC world. So that's one thing that when I step back and I talk to my class about, like, why is this hard? Why does this seem so hard? Like, regulations have been around for so long, financial system has been just fine. And it's fine to a degree, but it starts tearing at the edges when we're just saying, like, look, actually, technology has gotten to the point where it's ubiquitous. Everyone's got it, right? These aren't like, it's not like the computers of the 1960s where only a few places with huge data centers and, like, a computer the size of my office right now would just spit out a few equations. Whereas, like, right now, everyone's got mobile phones and everyone's got laptops. This really changes dynamics. So the scale really makes a difference. The ubiquity makes a difference. And then we fast forward to, like, well, can we make this more in the public interest? Can we make this achieve the same policy goals, but serve the public better? I was thinking about John's analogy where he brought up hey, don't steal your neighbor's lawnmower. You want to mow your grass, go get yourself your own lawnmower. I think that that's absolutely right. But let's think that what would happen if technology came about where it turned out that you could buy seeds of grass that you never needed to mow. And then the lawnmower agency said, hey, because you didn't use a lawnmower, you can't have this grass. Like, that's kind of what we are butting up against, is like, hey, we have a new way of having lawns, and an agency that went around saying, like, there's only one way to measure whether or not you have mowed your lawn correctly, hired the right people to mow your lawn. Are they licensed people to mow your lawn? Did you get your lawnmower in the correct, store, whatever that may be? Again, maybe those were really great rules when we didn't have this particular seed, but we do now. And so what are we going to do about that? And so like, I think that that's an overgeneralization of kind of the way that I think about this, but I think it's like helpful to put that in that framework for how I talk to my class about it. Now, about what's happening in this new year of regulations, I think like we're not seeing anything in regulations, right? Like we're right now where that's not going to happen in an election year, which I know we'll talk about later. We are seeing a lot more enforcement. And something else that I talk to about my class about is the idea that when you are an agency, you have two principal tools, right? You have either regulation or enforcement, and they're at either end of the spectrum. And in between that, there's a lot of other things that an agency can do, right? They can issue guidance, they can have investigations, they can have a bunch of roundtables, which you'll see, you know, speeches that you'll see. And for a while, I think that when you have a new technology, that's probably where the agency is going to be. There's a lot of fact finding. So you saw hints of that in the way that the SEC was operating for a while as well, right? The Dow report is a good example of that, that came out. I think it was, what was that, 2019 or 2017? I can't remember, but like it was around then, and people found that to be a helpful guide of what was going on. And the agency, the SEC, went to great trouble to outline a set of issues that have found to be helpful guidance. And it also said, and we're not going to create an enforcement action out of this. This is going to be an example for the industry. And that's where we were. But now where we are is like, we haven't seen regulation and which is one tool that an agency can use. And instead, what we're seeing is much more enforcement action. That alone is not a bad thing or a good thing, but it's something to note that we're not in a space where we're seeing both those ends of the spectrum being used at the same time. What we're seeing is one end of that spectrum being used almost exclusively, as opposed to the other end of the spectrum being used at the same time. So Josh, I'm going to punt it to you of what you want to dive into.
No, that was fantastic. Thanks for giving us some thoughts. And not only, I mentioned earlier being a fly on the wall at the SEC, but maybe being a fly on the wall at in your class. That sounds fascinating. John, did you before I want to take a couple minutes to see if you had any thoughts as well before we sort of pivot to some potential issues with registering exchanges or securities. Did you have any follow-on comment?
Yeah, so when I was chief of the Office of Internet Enforcement, again, that was for 11 years, and special counsel for internet projects for 4 years before that, I was an internet evangelist. You know, I helped train all the staff at the SEC in the enforcement division to use the internet. It was this incredible thing that was changing the way we did everything. And the job was really to police it so that it could thrive. And I think, you know, the SEC was very successful along those lines because all these incredible, you know, there were no electronic brokerages when I started at the SEC, and they all have come about, and generations of them have come, you know, from E-Trade to Robinhood, you know, so you've really had incredible growth of these incredible institutions. I mean, I guess the first thing is you look at the Dow 21A report. I think that's a perfect example, and I think it was 2017, and I'm glad Hermine brought it up because it really, 21A reports at the SEC are kind of one of those interesting enforcement tools where you essentially write what's called a report of investigation. And anytime you bring an SEC case, the defense counsel will always say, would you consider a 21A report? You know, about insider trading or about something, because this guy didn't know what he was doing that. Why don't you do a 21A report so no one gets sanctioned? So I thought that was a really great way for the SEC to start their regulatory actions regarding crypto. And then they did their usual thing where they issued interpretive guidance and no action letters. And some people would argue, and I bet Hermine teaches this, is that it's really crazy, and Josh, you know this as well, just how many ways the SEC can legislate without being Congress. And that drives everybody crazy, including me. You know, that I just feel like just because some SEC lawyer gives a speech doesn't make it law. And what the audience should understand, and I love the way Hermine presented this, is that, you know, the SEC is just another litigant. They are just as much as if I file a civil action, I am to be afforded the same level of deference analysis as the SEC when the SEC files a civil action. And I was a criminal prosecutor also for the U.S. Attorney's Office, and that's different, but the bottom line is an SEC, because that's a criminal action, so that's very different. The SEC's actions are just civil. They have no criminal authority, and their remedies are pretty limited. Damages, disgorgement, injunctions against future conduct, office and director bars, things like that. So what's happened over time is that this enforcement division, if you look at insider trading, okay, derivatives, the Foreign Corrupt Practice Act before the Foreign Payments Program, if you were bribing a foreign government, muni bonds, you can look at all of those areas, and there are no statutes dealing with any of them. People think, oh, insider trading, there must be some insider trading definition and some statute. For the most part, there's a few little bits and pieces. It's just completely judge-made, and it's very confusing for people. It would be much better, I agree, if there were a big insider trading definition statute and a broad framework. I mean, it could be better, but the bottom line is there isn't. And so you have this incredible section, it's called Section 10B and Rule 10b-5, and that's how the SEC brings their enforcement actions. So you look at the Dow report, the 21A report in 2017, you look at all the speeches, you look at the initial cases brought, and the SEC was very loud and clear. And I'm not an SEC shill. If you look at my writings, I've been incredibly critical of the SEC on so many occasions. I wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal criticizing Mary Jo White specifically for some things she did when she was chair. I've written extensively about a bunch of recent SEC court enforcement actions and a bunch of SEC rulemakings where I've come out. I think the SEC administrative courts that they use, which is really bizarre, most people don't understand what they are, is completely inappropriate. There's no discovery, there's no due process. So I can be a huge SEC critic. I've written extensive criticisms, probably more than 50 or 100 times. So in legal publications. But in this instance, I think they sort of took it slow. And if you look at the crypto industry, it would be nice if we had an industry that was really receptive to regulation. But if you look closely at when there has been let me give you just 4 very quick examples, Josh. I'll move quick. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, that actually had provisions that said that Form 1099s, which are these things from your brokerage firms, that the reason you don't cheat on your taxes when it comes to your brokerage firm, your brokerage accounts, the reason why you pay your capital gains is because those reports go directly to the IRS. So when it comes to your stock transactions, the IRS can see them. The same thing would go for crypto under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. There'd be these Form 1099s that would have to be filed by crypto intermediaries, or the Form 8300, which is really sort of a money laundering report, which is if you're going to go down 47th Street and try and buy a Rolex on 47th Street with crypto, they're going to have to file this Form 8300 with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. The crypto industry, totally against that, trying to get a stop. The SEC has tried to change the definition of alternative trading system. That's Rule 3B16. They're trying to say, hey, if you have an alternative trading system and it involves crypto, that needs to fall under this definition as well. Crypto industry totally against it. The Office of Foreign Assets Control has filed sanctions against an entity called Tornado Cash, which allows you to launder your crypto. So it's already untraceable, but make it even more untraceable. Crypto industry against that. FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, has put forth a bunch of anti-money laundering rules, and the crypto industry completely against that. So you do have this entire, every time there's some new legislation, the crypto industry is always against it unless it's completely light touch. So while I can appreciate the desire for regulations and to ease off the enforcement, I question whether these entities are really just looking for a much lighter touch. That's my thoughts, Josh.
Awesome. Thanks,
I'm
John.
sure Hermine, you gotta let Hermine respond, though.
You gotta let me respond to that one.
Look at her; she's
I can
going
see
crazy. Give her some time to respond, because I loaded that one up with all the kind of stuff that's going to get her going. So go ahead.
Yeah.
So Hermine, before you respond, let's just segue this into our discussion of token and registration.
Sure.
I know that Chair Gensler remarked that the, crypto security issuers need to register. One of the things John talked about was we have all these rules in place. So definitely respond. But as you're doing so, can you talk about what are the challenges for token issuers, for exchanges to potentially register with the SEC so that we use these protections? So sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
Yeah. Good. So one thing to note for this audience that I think may not be obvious is John and I are going to throw out terms like statute versus regulations versus judge-made law, and
Yeah.
those actually are very different. As a general member of the public, you may not understand the difference between them, but they actually are very fundamentally different kinds of ways that the government at large, oversees our activity, oversees the public's activity. So statute is something that's, I hope that no one minds me just reversing on this, but I think it's helpful. Statute is something written by Congress, legislated by Congress. We all know how dysfunctional Congress is, right? And getting all 535 of those members plus the president to sign something into law is quite hard to do. And it doesn't happen all that frequently for them to all agree. So when that happens, we all consider that to be the gold standard of laws, right? Like, unless the Supreme Court vacates it because it's unconstitutional for some reason, that is the law of the land. Now, the problem is that getting all those members to agree and then being able to think through all the things that they can do, only 535 members, right, of Congress. Like, that's not a lot of people when you compare it to just the full force of every agency in the federal government, right? We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people in just a couple of the agencies alone, right? Like millions when you count all of the different kinds of regional places that we've got. So he's very concerned. He just broke the succulent. But the idea that these regulatory agencies like ours, the SEC, they become the experts in their very narrow area of this entire domain of statutory law, right? That covers everything. So then they draft up regulations because they're the experts that kind of like interpret for everyone through notice and comment rulemaking what are going to be the real way that we interact with those laws for that discrete audience. Fine. And then sometimes what will happen is that maybe the audience, the population that's being regulated by the regulator doesn't like it, whatever happened, and they'll go and sue. And then in court, that lawsuit may come up with a different permutation of the agency's interpretation, and that will override the agency's interpretation, right? So like if we're kind of staggering or putting some sort of hierarchy, statutory law comes first, then there's going to be judge-made law, and then there's going to be the agency's regulations. And then within regulations are the gold standard of what a regulatory agency can do. Like John said, interpretive guidance, speeches, those are not laws. Those do not have the effect of laws, right? So but the problem is that they're an indication of how the agency is thinking. So people think of it as like smoke signals. And if you violate those smoke signals from the agency, you could be in hot water, possibly. You might have an investigation. Respond to that investigation could be very, very costly for you. Okay, so fine, we've stepped back and zoomed out. Let me zoom in on a couple of the issues that John brought up of the way that the crypto industry is kind of full of bollocks when it's saying like, hey, we're good actors here, but we don't like any of these things. Like, I think for the infrastructure bill example that John brought up, it's a good example of when the industry was very coordinated in a response. Yes, bud, was very coordinated in its response, but it was coordinated in a more narrow way than we might think. How it was narrow was like, look, we all agree that gains and losses should have it's a taxable event, and that when anyone, including those in the crypto community, gain money, they need to report that. No one's against reporting. However, it's that in this instance, the requirement of the bill was like, let's get the intermediaries of those gains and losses to report. That's fine when those intermediaries act like the brokers that we're traditionally used to being brokers, having some sort of financial fiduciary duty, like the Coinbases and the Geminis and the Krakens of the world. Hey, bud, yes, that's right. Again, we had to talk about this, bud. Okay, and so these it's totally fine that these intermediaries have it, especially when they have a fiduciary responsibility, right? But when you start talking about the miners of the network who don't know who it is, they're not the ones with the fiduciary responsibility, right? So it's like saying, hey, because you may have used Visa for processing a transaction, Visa is now responsible for submitting 1099s on every transaction you made because that might have been a gain or a loss. And that's not the kind of like broker we think about traditionally, but it was being applied in this sense. So again, this is the kind of nuance of like when you're really butting up against a new technology and how to think about it, it's helpful to have analogies, but sometimes the analogies are going to break down with what we're traditionally used to. So then let's take that right to Josh's question of like, how do we apply this to tokens and registrations? One of the challenges when it comes to talking about crypto in the security space is that there's Bitcoin and there's almost everyone else, right? Like, and one of the challenges is Bitcoin, the most popular of all of the crypto tokens, everyone agrees does not fit at this point into this traditional investment contract structure. And we're not worried about that. We even know that we're not worried about this at this point because the SEC has permitted for the Bitcoin ETF to be traded if Bitcoin were actually a security. Then the preliminary, that would have begged the question of like, why isn't it registered? And so now we know for sure that it's not a security. Now the challenge is that there's going to be other things that are blockchain tokens that people are going to use and promote, like investment contracts, and those are securities. So at what point does something transition from those things, those like obvious securities instruments, to the Bitcoin standard of not being a security? And when it's not a security, right, it doesn't go through the S1 process that, let's be clear, costs a lot of money to go through the registration process. It should cost a lot of money to go through the registration process, right? Because what are you doing? You're raising money from the public, and we don't like it. None of us like it if you're going to be raising money from the public and you have an information asymmetry. You're withholding information from the public. You're not being upfront. But with the Bitcoin protocol, the Bitcoin network, again, we have a decentralized structure. We have one where no single entity management system is making decisions. We've got a bunch of people participating. Everything is transparent. Fine. But if you're going to, if we were to pretend for a second that the Bitcoin network were a security, practically what would have to happen is like, not only would we have to do the S1 registration, we would like, who would register at that point, right? And how do they hold shareholder events? What is considered a shareholder in that situation? Who does the periodic reporting? Who's going to pay for the periodic reporting? What's considered to be a management risk, right? What is considered to be a risk factor? And who's going to take responsibility for that? Who's going to take responsibility for a cybersecurity event? What is considered a cybersecurity event in that situation, right? These are real problems when you're applying to the Bitcoin network. And they become problems as well for possibly the Ethereum Foundation. They aren't going to be a problem for probably the 24,000 plus others where it's clear to identify where there's a management entity, right? And so I think that the point that sometimes people get caught up on is like, oh, the crypto industry is like, hey, not us, because how could Bitcoin ever do that? That's right. How could Bitcoin ever do that? But the question that is not how can Bitcoin ever do that? We've already passed on that. And like the question is, can it happen? Would it be appropriate for you? And that's not like, like we saw this in the Terraform case and the Torres decision as well, where Rakoff and Torres differed a little bit, but they talked about how securities laws are applied on a case-by-case basis, right? And like that's not that's right. That makes sense to apply it on a case-by-case basis, and it makes a lot more sense to apply it on a case-by-case basis when you can find a management team, right? Like the moment there's a management team, I just feel like that's one of those issues that notice becomes very like obvious to do, right? Like who are you going to notice? That used to be something that would be really hard, but like if you can identify someone to notice, that points you to the direction of when we get scared as an agency about what is someone withholding then from their public. Okay.
Yeah. So Hermine, I have one quick follow-up question on that came through. So what you mentioned the management team. When we can identify the management team, what happens to investors if the regulation is just so onerous that they have to shut down? So like an example, Uniswap Labs gets shut down because of this enforcement. What happens in that situation?
So that's a really fair question about enforcement. So you'll see two things that have happened, right? Like is that there could be times when the industry itself coalesces around some of this as almost a pro bono kind of thing, right? We've seen that industry participants and the trade associations stepped up. Advocacy groups sued on behalf of Tornado Cash, for example, which was, John and I know, like disagree on the substance of it, which is whether or not Tornado Cash was the appropriate party to be sued by and shut down. Like the argument from the crypto industry was that Tornado Cash in that instance was acting like a software. So like, it's like, look, yes, maybe Microsoft Excel was used to keep records of the money laundering activities of some mob entity, but the problem is not Microsoft Excel. The problem is the mob entity that was like money laundering, right? So that was the distinction that the crypto industry was making with Tornado Cash. But nevertheless, the point of like Tornado Cash is that would have probably, been no brainer. Tornado Cash like can't operate. It doesn't really have those kinds of funds to defend itself. And this is why, as John mentioned earlier, like when an agency starts doing kind of interpretive guidance and speeches and forces an industry or any registrants or any population to adhere to not regulation, but those lesser kinds of actions, it becomes really difficult because you don't have bright lines. It becomes very hard for people to know whether or not something applies. And it can change with the winds of who's in charge, who's politically appointed to what kind of office, and what's the new headline of the day. And did they happen to make a speech from the Economic Club or on Squawk Box, right? Like,
definitely. No, that's and I hope we'll have a little time at the end to maybe to read the political tea leaves. But thank you, Hermine, on answering those. John, I want to and feel free to respond to anything, but also I wanted to ask you about, Coinbase has filed this petition for rulemaking, and we've seen some recent action on that in terms of whether or not the Third Circuit would force the SEC to reply. They didn't really get a reply, and then they said, okay, it's denied, and now there's other entities. Can you just talk about this situation? And Coinbase is alleging that it violates the Administrative Procedures Act, that the denial was arbitrary, capricious. What does all this mean? And do you think Coinbase will be successful? What are they even asking for?
Well, no, I think it's a PR campaign. I mean, it's brilliant. Obviously, you listen to Hermine, you can see how bright she is, and that's the kind of people that Coinbase has, and they have remarkable ways of creating vehicles to use their message. I mean, the Administrative Procedures Act, Josh, my favorite part of the Administrative Procedures Act is the requirement that the SEC rules be subjected to a cost-benefit analysis, because that's really clear cut. You can go to the court and you can say, you know what, Your Honor, the SEC passed this rule, like they recently passed an absurd rule that says if there's a cybersecurity incident at at a company, a public company, they have to disclose that within 4 days because it's a material event, even though there's already a rule that says you have to disclose all material events. So it's a redundancy, and it's created, of course, tremendous havoc for companies. What's a cybersecurity event? And you don't know anything until typically, and I'm an expert on this, 6 weeks after it happens. So how do you make any disclosure? And if you make the disclosure, are you tipping off the bad guy? Here's what's going on. Here's how they got into our system. And, welcome aboard if anybody else wants to try the same thing, because we're in the middle of figuring out a remediation. So I love that part of the Administrative Procedures Act that says, hey, when it comes to these statutes, that these rules that the SEC decides in its infinite wisdom make sense, because again, they're not Congress, but they have this rulemaking authority, and the courts can shut that stuff down by saying, look, you didn't do the proper economic analysis, which, Josh, was your specialty in these circumstances. No matter how challenging it is, you have to do it. Now, the flip side, like the Bitcoin ETF or like this petition for rulemaking, is that the court would make, at best, like a vague declaration, hey, SEC, you have to do some rulemaking. So in the end, the SEC might do a rule that absolutely says what Coinbase doesn't want. So I think it's just, a very ingenious PR campaign created by some very smart lawyers who are being paid a lot of money to really promote this stuff and get it going. But let's remember what we're talking about, Josh. Okay, let's just talk about Bitcoin for a minute. No cash flow, no yield, no employees, no management, no balance sheet, no product, no service, no history of operations, no analytical valuations, no earnings reports, no proven track record of adoption or reliance. Fails as an investment because there's no regulatory oversight, no transparency, no consumer protections, no insurance, no licensure, no net capital requirements. It's just a giant Walking Dead-like anarchical marketplace and free-for-all. And none of this, I lecture at different places, different schools, including at Duke, where I teach now. And it's like, tell me how this stuff should be valued. Tell me why is it going up? The reason it goes up is because of all the manipulation that's going on, because there's no oversight of it, and because it's just pure, unadulterated FOMO, fear of missing out. This is a great way to get rich quick. It's as old a scheme as the SEC has been fighting during its 80 years of existence. So, or maybe 90 years now. So you're talking about mathematical computational blather. It again doesn't function as an investment, fails as a currency. The price is way too volatile. The fees are too high. The taxes, every time you transact in crypto, you have to pay a capital gain if it went up. The risks are infinite. How can anyone accept crypto as a payment when it could be worth less the next day? And it's not a store of value. It lacks utility, intrinsic benefit, the measure of what an asset is actually worth. It has no value to store. When inflation kicked in really big, it was supposed to somehow combat that. It didn't. The marketplace, if you look at every study of the crypto marketplace, it's so rife with market manipulation, matched and wash trading. You look at SafeMoon, a recent case. 95% of transaction volume was allegedly washed and matched trading. 50 trillion SafeMoon tokens traded back and forth in one account via smart contracts. So, there's a reason why you want to be overwhelming in your attack on this stuff, because the vulnerable people, the people that get hurt the most, are the people who can't afford to experience this kind of pain, financial investor carnage. Look at Celsius, BlockFi, FTX, Terra. Voyager is my favorite one because I'm a big NBA fan. I mean, sadly, I'm a Washington Wizards fan, but I'm a big NBA fan. And I can't believe what Mark Cuban did. And it's not like I dislike Mark Cuban. I'd probably vote for him if he ran for president, but I can't believe what he did with Voyager. He went out with the whole Dallas Mavericks team and told everybody, hey, use this exchange. We're going to welcome you into the future of this wonderful technology that's going to be so transformative. And he gave them all, I think, $100 free credit to start up on Voyager. And every one of them lost everything. And, Mark Cuban's sort of like, he's being sued, of course. And I can't speak for him as to what his defenses are, but whatever his involvement was with these people, it's just awful what happened. And same thing if you read the victim impact statements at Celsius, one of these crypto exchanges. They have this whole thing, Josh, now where you wake up in the morning and they pause withdrawals. Like when I was at the SEC, that kind of thing would never happen. If some entity paused withdrawals, you'd immediately send a team of SEC examiners there. Enforcement would be there with subpoenas. And these intermediaries, they provide a critical function for people. And they're worth every penny, because you have plenty of ways that you can protect yourself. So when you order up your 100 shares of Microsoft, you know that transaction is going to take place. Those shares are going to be in your account and they're going to be yours. You're not going to be an unsecured creditor when they go under. I mean, read the victim impact statements, which were just filed in FTX just yesterday. A victim impact statement is when the victims come forward and can tell the judge before sentencing, hey, this is what my life is all about. And you see people living on ketchup to eat because they gave all their money because of all this FOMO. This is the world that we live in, where these crypto assets are pitched out there, but there's no there. Again, it's just complete nonsensical nothingness that through something called the greater fool theory, and that's something you study a lot when you're at the SEC, because it happens in microcap fraud and penny stock fraud. And it used to take, like in the Wolf of Wall Street, used to have these boiler rooms out on Long Island in New York, where I'm from. And, they would sit around and I remember when we were getting our training at the SEC, one of the things they taught us was that these guys would sit there with a stapler, like clicking in the ear, like click, 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 click in their ear, and to try to create, when they were on the phone, the ticker sound. So you had all of these incredible, and then the internet came along and said, you know what? We don't need these boiler rooms anywhere. We can use message boards, we can use spam, we can use social, and we can use that to create microcap fraud or to get people to buy penny stocks. Then crypto comes along and they're like, we can use social media. We can get everybody to say how great this stuff is and how wonderful it is and how amazing it's going to transform everyone's life. And we can tell them that it's going to get them out of poverty. And we can have this idea that, who cares? The greater fool theory, there'll be someone out there more foolish. And the irony of it all, Josh, the irony is that the original Bitcoin was created about this idea of disintermediation, which evolved into something they call decentralization, which after the subprime crisis was like, let's get rid of these banks and let's go peer-to-peer, let's go person-to-person and disintermediate, decentralize. And what do you have now with the Bitcoin spot ETF? You have one of the biggest financial behemoths in the world, like BlackRock, sucking fees out of people, acting like they're doing this for the benevolence of the world when they're doing it to get fees. I mean, who can't blame them? Maybe invest in BlackRock. They're smart. They're like, people love this Bitcoin. Who cares what it is? They do it under the auspices of financial inclusion, which is the most nauseating to me. Because if you look at studies at the Brookings Institution, Sanatsu and Carmona did a remarkable study at the Brookings Institution about how it doesn't foster financial inclusion. Michelle Singletary, a legendary writer for the Washington Post, African-American woman, she wrote a scathing rebuke how it doesn't help people of color. And I did my own study. I went to all these ATM machines. They are not ATM machines. They are crypto kiosks. They are completely unregulated. And I videoed the whole incident at my local Safeway store, where I put in my change and got like $75 worth of Dogecoin, and chronicled how much ridiculous the fees were. It's like payday loans and check cashing services, how ridiculous the fees were. And when I got home and tried to log in and take the money out, couldn't get it out. Tried to call customer service, emailed customer service, sorry, we can't help you. And there's no recourse. There's no one you can go to and say, look what happened to me. So that $75 is gone, and it's all documented video, a video of all the correspondence. So these and again, I know we're gonna get to this later. What is crypto so great for? Crime. There would be no ransomware in this world if there were no Bitcoin. And I can tell you that absolutely true. As an instructor at Quantico at the FBI Academy, ransomware evolved solely because of Bitcoin, and every ransomware attack demands Bitcoin, and it's never tracked down. The perpetrators are never caught. Occasionally there might be one that you find, like recently in New York, where the laptop was found in a popcorn tin under a blanket in a bathroom of these two crazy social media people. But the bottom line is drug dealing, terrorism. North Korea is financing their nuclear weapons program with crypto. So
Yeah,
what is it good for? So
let's
anyway,
hold that
not to
because
rant or rave, but
yeah, no, I definitely want to come
rant.
back to this. Thank you. Thanks for that. So Hermine, I want to let you come in. I know a buzzword came up just then, inclusion. So I will let you choose your own adventure here. Do you want to talk about financial inclusion, or do you want to talk about some of these enforcement actions that maybe, because we talked about the Ripple case, maybe setting a precedent, and then we've got Judge Rakoff's decision, we've got Judge Torres. We could talk about debt box, which is really recent and where the SEC got criticized. There was an 80-page order this week that John and I were joking about. How do we read these and keep up? So choose your own adventure here. What direction do you want to go on this?
Yeah, well, I think that the financial inclusion point is a really important one. And I think that let's tackle that right now. Like, right. So in the United States, there's a luxury for us where we actually have a really stable financial system. We don't experience inflationary rates of 30 to 90%, right? We don't have, like, our currency continues to be the world's reserve currency. And this is a great place to be. But you want to imagine that what would happen? We know that there's a large percentage of our country already that lives paycheck to paycheck. That sucks, but they can do it. They can make it happen. What if suddenly inflation went up to 30% in the next month? What would happen to those people, right? like and so where would they, like, is the right thing for them to be like, fingers crossed, this, like, I can't, like, I'm just gonna take out a bunch of payday loans and hope for the best that next month things will all go back right and I can live paycheck to paycheck again, and somehow I'm gonna have to just dig myself out of the hole of the 30-40% interest rate that I had to take out for those payday loans just to get bread and rice on the table, right? Like, but that is actually one of the things that's happening. And what we saw actually in the very unfortunate incident that's going on in Nigeria right now, right, where we have 2 Binance employees that have been held over there indefinitely because Nigeria is not happy that crypto was turned to by its population as a more popular form of currency because the Nigerian currency was suffering from such extended periods of inflation. And so its population was like, this is so unstable for us. We can't survive like this. We need to find an alternative. And there was an alternative available to them. And they used it. And this was not being, this is used by everyday people to pay for everyday goods. This is not about crime and ransomware and money laundering on a day-to-day basis by the entire population, right? This is just to get by. So there's that. Here in the United States, if there's a couple of things I want to point out is, like, in the United States, what we find is that there was a recent Fed report that I have my class read. And it's not unique to crypto. It's about the economic well-being of the United States. But what we know from that Fed report, and it looks at all sorts of access to financial systems. How are people, accessing loans? How are people using credit cards? And they break it down by income and by ethnicity. And what we see is that the underbanked of our country, and I'm not saying unbanked, the unbanked is already a problem, right? But the underbanked, meaning that they have some access to financial rails, but they're still not using it. They're still choosing to go to very predatory systems. That is, depending on which ethnicity you look at, if you are looking at the Black American population here in the United States, that's 27%. That's crazy. And that's a problem. And it's a problem that our country hasn't addressed yet, right? Now, if we look at kind of how that relates to crypto, there's a part of that report that talks about how much of the population in the United States actually holds crypto. The Fed report says 6%. The industry would like you to believe that's closer to 20% of the US population. I'm fine taking the Fed report of 6%. But if we break down that 6% and think about how is that 6% of the population using or holding crypto, what we find is that if you are white or Asian, you are using it almost entirely for, to John's point, investment purposes. But as you go down the income levels and you go to different ethnic groups, you'll find that it increases for using it as a payment transaction method. And why do we think that that is? And again, these people are actually using it for payments, not for speculative investments. So why do we think that that is? I'll just give you a really stark example of what would happen if you are, no pun on the name, John, but if you were to use, if you're a domestic violence victim, and you imagine for a second that you finally were able to bring together enough money to escape your abusive relationship, and you stuff the $1,000 you've got in your backpack and you grab your kids and you leave. Okay, what do you do next? Can you open a bank account? Probably not, right? Because one of the first things that an abuser does is withhold all of your financial access. They've got a freeze on your social security number. So you're not, they will freeze all of your credit cards, anything you use. And if you used any of it, your ATM card, your credit card, they will find you and track you down. And we've seen this even just like in new cars, right? That can report where people are, the profile that's programmed in. These domestic violence abusers will track them down there too, right? So then what's your alternative in this system where you can't get to financial rails and yet you have money? You're not trying to launder money. You're not trying to do ransomware attacks. You're not, you're just trying to make sure that you have a safe place. You can, and what if your friends and family know that you finally fled? How can they get you this money if you, again, don't have a bank account because everything of yours is frozen, right? These are, you could imagine that it may not be the domestic violence victim. We don't have a solution for that, by the way, right? Our current system does not have a solution for that. And that is a left behind population, which is a problem. But there are other people who don't have these these rails access for a myriad of reasons. Maybe someone, maybe a parent of theirs destroyed their credit a long time ago and they can't access it. And that happened when they were 14, 15 years old, right? And now they're in a vicious cycle of being unable to access. And that, again, this happens as we go lower down on our income scales and, in certain kinds of ethnic groups. So that it's not to say that crypto solves all those problems. And again, I think that it's really worthwhile to distinguish between crypto of Bitcoin, crypto stable coins, and then, meme coins and altcoins and all those other 24,000 kinds of coins, right? These are different buckets, and there's reasons why our policymakers think about their regulation in different buckets. Then there's also this idea that, look, if we don't regulate it through the SEC's securities regulations, we have no recourse as a general member of the general public. These Bitcoin ATM, fraudulent boxes at the mall are just, a plague on our society. The problem is that ATMs are regulated at the state level, and if there's an ATM that's out there that's marketing itself as an ATM and isn't doing what it should be, then that's a really big problem. And definitely, John, you should report it. And you know what? I will help you report it and I will help you find the right agencies. But if we think about the kinds of agencies that are available for a lot of these problems, we saw how a lot of these crypto exchanges, and these are, this is a separate issue of whether or not it's security. It's just are they regulated? We've seen New York DFS come down and take out huge fines from these intermediaries. Coinbase paid one for $50 million, right? California recently shut down staking programs here in the state. I know this personally because I'm a resident of California, right? The states have powers. If you have a complaint about an intermediary, the CFPB has a huge amount of power in that space. And there are complaints lodged against every intermediary with the CFPB. FTC also has huge authority in this space. DOJ has authority. We have a ton of agencies merely because the SEC isn't the primary enforcement vehicle doesn't mean that there is a lack of enforcement ability. So I think it's like really important for us to remember that these products, regardless of whether or not they're being used for payment methods or for investment methods, right? There are regulators that are beats on the cops for all of these different ways of thinking about it. And none of them are shy about using their authority.
Josh, this is why I want to sign up to be like Hermine's campaign manager when she runs for something, if she ever would. I mean, because her heart is so obviously in the right place. And a lot of crypto people are like this. I don't think they're all like this, but there are quite a few that just want to make the world a better place, and they see injustice in the traditional finance system that's right in front of them, and they see this as a possible solution, and they really want to work toward this kind of technological transformation that would make life better. You can't argue against that. You just can't, because again, you got genuine people like Hermine who are very bright and very engaged and really want to solve these problems. And what it illustrates is that there's this balancing act, right? Because, and it's funny to me, because you talk about money laundering. It's a major reason, because I'm kind of a libertarian myself. I don't like the government. I don't, again, read any of my writings, you'll sense like an extraordinary anti-government sentiment in just about everything I've ever written. And but if you look at just what the money laundering laws are, they're about 11 or 12 or 13 statutes: the Bank Secrecy Act, the USA Patriot Act, the Anti-Money Laundering Act. And what they essentially say is you don't have a right to any financial privacy. Your bank account at any time, your brokerage account at any time, somebody from the SEC can find out everything you've got in your brokerage account and every transaction you've ever done and every communication you've ever had with any financier. If you're with respect to your bank account, if the teller doesn't like the way you look, they can file a suspicious activity report. If you try to transact in more than whatever, $10,000, that's automatically done. If you do $9,999 and think you're being clever, that's probably the stupidest thing you could do, because it raises even more of an eyebrow. So every transaction, your money is subject to freezing. The government can freeze it, the IRS can freeze it. And the reason we have all of this supervision is because of terrorism, especially after 9/11. So, Congress decided, hey, when we balance this, we're going to make it hard for some people to get bank accounts. We're going to make it we're going to constantly look at everything you're doing. One of my spaces you mentioned, Josh, one guy was like, I love crypto. I can move $5 million through the airport and nobody knows the difference. And I get that. The guy doesn't want anybody to stop him when he's got his $5 million, but that's what we have in the US. And if you look at some of these foreign countries, I think Hermine makes a really good point. I don't travel enough to really know for sure whether crypto or Bitcoin is a good thing in those countries. I know it's not a good use for payment transactions in the US. I think from the fees to the tax consequences and everything else, and whether you can reverse it, and you lose all the intermediate protection. Remember, when you buy something on Amazon with a credit card, you got Amazon protection, credit card protection, bank protection. There's all these really nice things that make sure that if there's a bad transaction. Now, I just pulled this book. Ben McKenzie and my friend Jacob Silverman went to El Salvador and actually wrote a book about it. So and they came to my house and I talked to them and I listened, and I just think in a lot of these countries that are using crypto or Bitcoin, they're mostly corrupt. And I just don't think that, again, it's a good thing. I think it's all corruption. So I do kind of trust the people that have visited, but I get what Hermine's saying, that there is certainly a constituency that might benefit from this, and that typically it's going to be in one of these terrible countries without the kind of currency that we have here in the US. But I look at the externalities, which we obviously don't have time to get into, from ransomware to drug dealing to human sex trafficking. Look what's going on. And Zeke Fall just wrote an incredible book from Bloomberg about just what's going on in all these foreign countries with Tether, stablecoins used to enslave people. And there's a reason why the payment's always in crypto, because it's untraceable. And don't let anybody ever tell you that it is traceable, because it's not. So go ahead, Josh. I think I interrupted you.
Yeah, no, this is perfect timing. And I think we probably got about 10 more minutes to chat, and then I want to save some time for a few questions that came through.
Okay.
So let's just stay on the anti-money laundering and combating financing of terrorism. There was a report from Chain Analysis saying that stable coins alone enabled something like 40 billion in crypto-enabled crime. There's some, you mentioned earlier, you said that cyber breaches really wouldn't exist and ransomware wouldn't exist if it wasn't for
Right.
Bitcoin. And I couldn't help but think back to your time as the Office of the Internet and thinking, well, they probably wouldn't exist if we didn't have the internet either. And so
True.
we have to figure out which one of these is enabling. And I think we can all agree that money laundering is bad and we don't want this as part of our system. Either one of you, can you just sort of speak up about, when the Biden executive order came out, it really looked like stablecoin regulation was going to take place just because there was so much money stored in value. And then more recently, we've had, some sort of bipartisan support. I think the bill was introduced by Elizabeth Warren, thinking that maybe we would have some rules that would beef up the ability to monitor money laundering and financing of terrorism, especially after the attacks in Israel last year. Can either one of you just sort of talk about the prospects of those going through? It's an election year. You've both been in DC. The political wins in an election year. Will we see this Digital Asset Anti-Money Laundering Act go through? And even going back to the original sort of Loomis Gillibrand bill, will we see any traction of that? Will some of those bills come together? Is this a pre-election thing, or is this a wait and see who becomes president and who runs the House and the Senate? And so anything you can offer on that, I think for the next 10 minutes or so would be insightful.
Only 10 minutes, huh? So one of the things to note about the Biden executive order is that there was discussion of stable coins, but if you look through it, one of the things that the Biden executive order really focuses on is CBDC development. And I think it's really important to distinguish between CBDCs versus stable coins versus crypto, right? This audience probably understands it, but stable coin, CBDCs serve a different purpose than stable coins. Like CBDCs is a government backed currency, right? And so
no one wants a CBDC, right, Hermine? We both don't want that.
You it's like I would love to see a CBDC that worked, but it's not. I'm like suspect of a CBDC that can work, because when John brought up the idea of you get an Amazon credit card, it comes with all these protections. It comes with all those protections. It also comes with trade-offs, right? Like it's not merely trade-offs about privacy, right? But it's like you are now vulnerable to all sorts of risk vectors of people stealing your funds, impersonating you, stealing your identity. All of that stuff now is contained within there. You also are going to possibly have your private information sold off about what kind of money, how are you spending your money? Oh, you are now subject, you're gonna be bombed by all sorts of marketers that you did not sign up for, right? Your whole transaction history is now available for someone else to see. And would it be lovely if okay, could I transact without actually having to give all that up? And we don't have a way of doing that yet, right? But for possibly with crypto, right? But we don't, if we're just thinking about the traditional way of doing it, there's no one out there. There's no credit card issuer out there yet that has said hey, we're going to give you all of these protections and we're not going to get anything in return. We're just going to do it out of the kindness of our business. When we think about, so fine, I'll cabin that, but going to your question about the bills, about the Lummis-Gillibrand bill and any stablecoin legislation, even if we were to see a presidential not even if we see a president, we will see something's going to happen come November, and there might be a change in who holds that office. I think that regardless of that change, I haven't seen any indication from either candidate that they are going to be bullish on actually passing legislation. It's hard. I think it's hard to get legislation that will be a full crypto framework. I think that the lower hanging fruit is certainly going to be stablecoin regulation if you're going to have it. But even then, it's going to be very hard to convince half of Congress when you already know that there are not 100 senators, but maybe 50 almost senators, I think, that signed on to the AML bill that Warren proposed, right? And so you're going to have to get through stablecoin legislation that also appeases those interests, and those interests are very concerned about the kinds of things that John is concerned about, right? Is the money laundering. I do think that there's an opening for considering how much that legislation, that draft legislation has gotten support. I do think that there is an opening for some sort of must-pass bill, meaning like the infrastructure bill, right? Something that is like the administration needs to pass. It's tied to some sort of budget authority, and then in it, it's going to slip in some area of money laundering and tax revenue, because that was what the infrastructure bill was about, is how do we raise taxes so that we can cover all of these really important projects that we want. And so that's where I see something. I don't see stablecoin legislation being tucked into a must-pass bill.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
Probably not a standalone, but yeah, go ahead, John.
Yeah, I agree with Hermine on everything there, and I often asked to testify in front of Congress, and I've never done it because because there are very few SEC lawyers that want to be anti-crypto, and it's because it's just such a cash cow. Anybody who practices in the SEC space can make so much money doing crypto. I don't have any crypto clients. I don't make a nickel off of any of this stuff. So, I'm a good candidate for testifying. But I agree with Hermine. A lot of it is theater. The people are trying to do the right thing, but it's so combative and so polarized. But there are three things I would say that I think are interesting for this audience, and I'll make them quick. Number one, if Donald Trump becomes president, and there's a Republican chair of the SEC, I think that the crypto enforcement program will slow down dramatically. The crypto approvals that the SEC can do on their own will fly through. I think that'll happen. It's kind of interesting because Donald Trump, Maxine Waters, and Hillary Clinton in 2018 or 19 all had the same view of crypto. They all said it was a bad, terrible thing. It was actually not a political issue, but it's become that. So that's number one. I think that Hester Peirce would probably become acting SEC chair, and everything would change. No more resources would go to the crypto unit. They got 33 new positions last year. They'll get 0 under that type of agreement, whatever your political. The second thing is, I think Hermine probably agree with this, that Brian Armstrong tweeted, I think yesterday, being and he's the head of Coinbase, right? Being anti-crypto is political suicide. And I don't know if I agree with that as much, but I do agree, having done these spaces and everything, that crypto, the true believers, are a very active voting constituency. They may vote with their wallets, and they might actually, if they got organized, be able to swing things in some of these battleground states. I think that's a possibility. Smarter people than me who follow politics a lot say that issues don't matter. So that might be true also. But I do think that. And then the third thing, if you just look at rulemaking, even those things have stalled. FinCEN has this one rule that if you have more than $10,000 of cash overseas outside of the US, you have to report that. And that's a strict liability crime. You go to prison for 5 years for not reporting it. Okay, so there was a statement in 2020 from FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, that they were going to, of course, amend that to include crypto, but they still haven't done it. One of the things Elizabeth Warren's bill does is just says, hey, FinCEN, do what you said you were going to do. I'm not supporting Elizabeth Warren or supporting Donald Trump. I'm pretty agnostic when it comes to all that. But so those are three things. Like, you just look at that rulemaking, it hasn't happened. I don't get it. They said they were going to do it. What happened? So that's very quickly what I would say, that I don't know that there's any future for that legislation, but the presidential election is going to be incredibly important for crypto people.
Oh, thanks. No, I think I totally agree. And I know we had a little bit of this conversation ahead of time. And so we might be in a holding pattern, sort of wait and see what the outcome is. And this is probably a good segue to a few questions that came up. And so there's more than one question about, it looks like in the EU, they are being more proactive when it comes to coming up with a dedicated regulatory body, trying to set a framework. I think Coinbase, when the litigation came out, even talked about, well, you know, entrepreneurs in the space might move to the EU. We might even move some of our products overseas. Hermine, I know you probably had some potential insight on that as well, but one of the questions from Gustavo, can crypto regulators, can it be globally coordinated? And we've worked at the SEC and we know just how difficult that is for regulators to work together, especially with these memorandums of understandings. But is that something that can take place, or will we see sort of different crypto-friendly regimes break out and people will gravitate towards those regimes?
So I'm so grateful for the EU and for like Singapore, Japan coming up with some of these frameworks, because one of the things that is always helpful, just as a policy issue, right? Like, it's for someone who studies policy, right? You love to see some of these use cases almost of a regulatory framework, right? Like, so that you can see how people will dabble. People often ask in a new industry for a regulatory sandbox, right? You'll often find people saying, like, look, like, we as good faith actors with this new technology, we don't know what's going to happen. AI is probably a good example of this too, of like, we don't know what's going to happen, but like, give us, like, can we sign up somewhere to say we will be held by certain rules, and we can experiment with whether or not those rules are right, and then like sunset that in 2 years, 3 years time and then we'll have a lot more data to figure out what is the right course of action. But right now none of us have enough data, right? So that's great. The challenge when it comes to crypto is when it's a matter of investment, right? Investment class, the flow of investments goes through the United States. Whether or not we like it, that's just the reality of the securities industry in particular, right? Is like a lot of that is going through the United States. So like, we need these regulators to figure out one way or another if they're going to be like, no, we have decided it's all just Treasury-led AML and IRS Treasury-led tax issues, and that's it. And otherwise, everything else is going to be an enforcement action. Then that's where it'll be. And then who knows? Like, it'll take time. But if it were a matter like that's going to move off, like, and we see a lot of institutional investors actually moving off from the United States, that will be a separate problem, right? What you would like to see is, like, as a matter of transaction methods, you'd like to see a regulatory regime in some of these non-EU, non-investment focused countries. And we haven't necessarily seen that yet. So I think that in either case, it's going to take time because of the way that the securities and financial markets work versus probably like how we think about payment transaction markets working.
Thank you. And I think this notion of a regulatory sandbox is super fascinating, because as an economist, we always would have to estimate the costs of new rules. And you remember, it was difficult to quantify some things that were forward looking. And so why not run experiments and see what works, and having sunsets. I've heard some people propose more of like a self-regulatory organization, something akin to FINRA. And so, John, feel free to chime in on that. And there's also a question I think that's right in your wheelhouse. So June Kim asked, we were talking about ransomware and the use of crypto. Could the same have been said for US dollars before? And so if crypto didn't exist, what would they transact with in that situation? So feel free to answer one of those.
Well, they wouldn't. Like I said, ransomware didn't exist before Bitcoin, before crypto. And I know that. I've been in this space forever. Especially when I was at Strauss Friedberg, I ran their DC office, and they were a data breach response firm. And so I dealt with every type of cyber attack. And, you can't make a $5 million payment in cash. Okay. It's too heavy to lift. You can't get it from the bank. But Bitcoin solves every problem when it comes to that. And if you look at cyber attacks, that's how they evolved, right? It used to be that they would steal data from companies and then go to the dark web and sell that data. Whether it be social security numbers or credit card numbers or private data, that was generally what would happen. But the DOJ did a really good job of shutting down a lot of those sales and tracking those people down through international agreements. Like, international law enforcement is doable. International regulatory frameworks was generally not. You know, you have treaties, memorandums of understanding with whatever 20, 25 countries. But so when it comes to all of this international working these cases, if you look at what happened with the cyber attacks, they suddenly realized, wait a minute, why steal this data? Why not just freeze it or dump it on social media? So it's sort of like name and shame. Take the data, steal it, and say, hey, if you don't pay us, then they're doing their own disintermediation. They don't have to sell the data anymore. So they go to your company, and I get calls like this almost every day, by a company who's been hit by a ransomware attack. And in North Carolina, where I go to school, when they had where I teach, when they had the Colonial Pipeline, you couldn't get gas. People were stranded at the airport. There were no cabs, no Ubers, no nothing. Nobody could get gas. It was like the 70s when I was little, and there were these mega gas lines. And it gets kind of scary. Like you realize, wow, we're only a couple of days away from like lawlessness here. And I mean, that's not hyperbole, I'm telling you, because I was there. So I think that what happened with ransomware is they just sort of said, wait, we can extort, we freeze up people's systems and we tell them to make a $5 million payment. And guess what? Most of the time, or many times, these companies pay. It's just amazing. And I was at the FBI just recently at a big meeting dealing with ransomware. And I said to the main team of ransomware defenders from the FBI to the U.S. Attorney's Office, meaning the DOJ, the Department of Justice, I said, do you ever recover ransomware payments? No. How often? Never. Do you ever catch any of these people? No. Why? Well, because we barely even know where they are. And people, and people love to say that crypto is traceable. Well, why in 2023 did we have like $2 billion worth of ransomware payments made, and none of them ever recovered and no one ever caught? So you really can't, like your questioner asked, could you do this with cash? You can't do it. You can't go to the bank and get the money. You can't move the money. You can't travel overseas with the money. It's just a very cumbersome thing. But with crypto, it's instantaneous. My wife just got hit with an attack just 2 days ago. Pay this in crypto. So we fixed it. It wasn't that big a deal. But remember, cybersecurity is an oxymoron. Okay, there's no such thing. It's like Hermine trying to get your son not to come home with a cold from kindergarten. Are you going to blame the school, or are you going to blame the teachers? So ransomware is a real problem. It's not going away. It's just getting worse and worse and worse and worse. And it didn't exist before Bitcoin.
Thank you. No, those are good analogies. So this is probably a good time because I know these webinars have a hard stop. They will actually just force us off. So I want to take some time and thank both of our speakers, John, you and Hermine. That was a very insightful discussion. I think we will have to have an after hours, maybe in a Twitter space at some point, because we didn't get to a slew of questions, and I'm sure there's others that have questions. But thank you so much for speaking today, offering your thoughts on all of these issues, and hope to potentially have you back together. And also want to thank Fahad for letting us use this space to have this discussion.
Yeah, absolute honor to be with you too. Yeah, Hermine, just again, sign me up for when you want to run for something. Let's start a movement to get her to run for something, Josh. She'll do it, right? If we work hard enough.
I'm a believer. I've seen her work at the SEC. So, but many thanks. And yeah, we'll do this again soon, hopefully.
Great. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone.